3 and verse 20. And this is, of course, Genesis 3 very often is referred to the fall. I don't actually like that language. It's the introduction of sin into the world is the way I like to say it. I'm not one that believes that the nature of man changed at this point. The nature of man's relationship to God changed, and the nature of man's relationship to the earth changed. The load of work that we are required to do increased. A lot of things like that happened, but I think ultimately the nature of man is the same. At any rate, in verse 20, at the end of the Lord's discipline that he gave to the serpent and to the woman and to the man, this observation is made. The man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all of the living. Okay, go ahead. Because she was the mother of all the living. What does that mean, that Eve was the mother of all the living? Everybody stems from these two people. And Eve is directly connected physically to every living human being. Now that is a significant point, and we're going to make and draw some things of significance from that in a moment. But we don't want to stop there. We want to turn over a couple of chapters to Genesis chapter 9. In Genesis chapter 9, we want to read verses 18 and 19. The context here is the flood has taken place. God has destroyed all the living, spared Noah and his sons and their wives and the creatures that were on the ark. The waters have receded. They have now gone out into the world, received some instructions, a few minor changes, such as the allowance of eating of animals at this point, where before it had been green plants that had been given for food. He now says that they can eat every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. There's some other instructions pertaining to human discipline against murderers, and a few other things, so the instruction to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And in connection with that, verses 18 and 19 says, the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. That's kind of an important thing later on when you read about Canaan and the Canaanites. You know that they are descended through Ham. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. What does that mean? We have entirely too many people here tonight for everybody to speak at one time. They did. And that's... Their wives were on the ark with them. Their wives were on the ark with them. They began to have children. Were they dispersed over the earth? They themselves, Shem, Ham, and Japheth? No. And in fact, we don't find out how men were dispersed all over the earth for a couple of chapters in the story of Babel and God's action to separate men. We've already talked about that event earlier in this study. What we find out here is that all of those people who were spread throughout all the earth and who dispersed and replenished the earth came from the line of Ham, the line of Shem, or the line of Japheth. And so, once again, we have a convergence of humanity. All three of those individuals, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were the son of whom? Noah. So, everyone is of the family of Noah. There is no one alive on the earth that is not a direct descendant of Noah. And that's important for us to understand. Go over one chapter, chapter 10, and verse 32. These are the clans of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. And so we have a description starting in chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel story, and going through there, of how it is that from this one family, we ended up having an earth that was populated. We ended up having various nations spread around the earth and various peoples. We tend to think of ourselves as being unrelated to people from the other side of the world. When we see as Westerners people from the Eastern nations, we tend to think that they are a different people than us. When we see African nations, we tend to think they're a different people from us. That is why we look at foreigners as being barbarians. And by the way, that carries and is throughout history that's been the case. The Bible talks about it. When you run into people whom seem to be speaking gibberish, they don't understand what you're trying to communicate with them, they do things different than you, they look different than you, what do most people assume? That they're primitive. That's exactly right. That they're primitive, that they're undeveloped, that they need our help because their way of life is not as advanced as our own. Their way of thinking is not as advanced as we tend to look at them through the lens of our superiority and their deficiencies. But in fact, what we learn in Genesis 3, Genesis 9, and Genesis 10 is every person on the face of the earth, no matter what nation they are from, no matter what clan they belong to. What's a clan, by the way? Okay, but it's we use the word family ultimately to mean a nuclear family unit. And that's a great way to illustrate this. The Campbell clan are all of those people who arise from the broad family who wear the name Campbell. And so all of these people whom you would not call relatives are part of that clan. They would be your clansmen. And so a clan is a larger unit than a family. And then you take several clans and you make a city or a town. You take a bunch of towns and you have, and we're going to use our terminology, a state. You take a bunch of states and you have a nation. And we share in common our nationality with people from Rhode Island, but they're not from Louisiana. Maybe a better example would be we share a nationality with Texans, but they're not from Louisiana. And vice versa. By the way, what do Texans believe? What do they believe? That everyone who's not a Texan is a little bit inferior. They just don't understand how wonderful it is to be Texan. And by the way, the folks in Louisiana feel the same way. And that just goes on and on and on. People of the South think that way of folks from the North, our folks from the West. We tend to view people that are different than us through a lens of them being inferior to us, when in fact, what we're being told here in Genesis 3, 9, and 10 is every one of us, no matter what clan we belong to, what family we belong to, what city, what state, what nation, what place on the globe, continent we belong to, no matter what skin color we have, no matter anything about us, we all arose from the three sons of Noah by way of Eve. And so in truth, despite how different we see things, what is the truth about mankind? We're all the same. We're literally from the same family, if you go back far enough. By the way, in Matthew chapter 1, when Jesus' genealogy is traced, what does Matthew do? No. Is it Matthew or is it Luke that does it? It's Luke that does it, I think. Anyway, one of them. Yeah. What do? They trace it to Noah, and they trace it back to Adam. I think it's Luke that goes all the way back to Adam. Right. And so I think Matthew stops with probably Abraham. But Luke goes all the way back to the descendants of Noah, and then ultimately back to Eve, or Adam. And so we have clear teaching in the Scriptures that talk about we're literally physically connected to one another. We are of the same family. When people talk about races, when people ask me what my race is, my general answer is human. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it's a strange way to communicate, but guess what they're doing? They're doing exactly the same thing that I'm doing. They're just using different sounds to communicate ideas and to communicate those ideas to other people over distance. And who knows, maybe that's a more efficient way of communicating. I have a great appreciation for the Western languages that arose out of Latin, such as Spanish, in those languages that are much more precise than the English language. And certainly more precise than the American version of the English language. The American version of the English language is all over the map. But we're superior. And so what we need to start seeing and developing from this is that we shouldn't look at other living, breathing human beings as anything different than ourselves, with the one exception of what? Okay, with the one exception of the transformation that takes place through obedience to God, having our renewal of our mind that Romans chapter 12 talks about, with the exception of those that have received the grace of God compared to those who haven't. Obviously, those who have received the grace of God should behave differently because we're not doing what we would do by our own desires and will. Our will is informed by the will of God. And if we were left to our own desires to pursue those things that we wanted to do, guess how we would behave? Just like everybody else in the world. And a good way to learn about that is Romans chapter 1. How did the Greeks or the Gentiles, as being talked about in Romans chapter 1, get to the place that they were so far removed from God? Well, God left them up to their own devices to do what they willed to do. And that's where it brought them. By the way, chapter 2 of that same book in Romans says that the Jews ultimately ended up in the same place, right? Because instead of pursuing the will of God, though they had been entrusted by His word, or had with His word, they themselves pursued their own desires and ended up separating themselves from God. And really, there wasn't a whit's bit of difference between the two, even though there should have been. And so anytime we think about these things, The only difference is what we have learned from God and the transformation of our thinking as a result of that. And so behaviorally, there are differences between people. Some people behave different than other people. But behavior is not dictated by nature. How do we know that behavior is not dictated by nature? Well, let's go to Acts 17 for a moment. Paul is addressing the Greeks in Athens. Verse 22, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious. Now, there's a lot of differences between how the Greeks practice religion and how the Jews practice religion, right? There's a world of difference between what went on in Greek temples and worship rites and what the Jews did. And the question then arises, why would the Greeks be interested in hearing what Paul has to say? Why does it matter what this Jewish man who comes in among them has to say about anything? So look down at verse 26. Well, let's back up a little bit. Verse 24. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. Now, is that not what we just read in Genesis? In Genesis, what was that, chapter 10 and verse 32? That from the clans of the children of Noah, every nation of mankind that filled the earth arose. And that's exactly what Paul is saying here. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. God's in control with when nations arise and when they fall and how long they last and all of those other things. How big they are, how small they are, what the boundaries of them are. That they should seek God. Who's they in verse 27? All the nations. All the nations from all over the earth. He made from one man every nation of mankind, that they, every nation of mankind, should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, yet he's actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, even as some of your own poets have said, we are indeed his offspring. And so what Paul ultimately is teaching these Greeks is the very same thing that we learned in Genesis 3, 9, and 10. That despite the fact that they spoke Greek, despite the fact that they had a different form of government, despite the fact that they lived in this nation and were distinct and different from the Hebrews, and despite the fact that they had different practices, the truth of the matter is that they all arose from the same God, and they all arose from the same place, and that they were all connected through one man. And it didn't really matter where you went. If you went into northern Europe, which the New Testament refers to as the residing place of the barbarians and these other peoples, the people that we think of the northern people, the Norse people, as they were barbarians. The fact of the matter is that they were exactly like the people who was finding them. No difference at all, no superiority. They had all come from the same parents. And that is an important lesson. Since this is true, every single living human being is a direct descendant of Eve and is a direct descendant of the sons of Noah. We are all not just made by the same God, but literally made from the same creation. There's a reason why we talk about procreation when we talk about having children today. What does the word procreation mean? That's a good guess. In this sense, the prefix pro means in favor of, working toward, helping out, serving, as opposed to anti, which would be against or trying to stop or end creation. We had one creative act, Adam and Eve, and every birth since then has been a continuation of and an advancement of that act of creation. Yes. Yeah, that's funny. So, since these things are true, can you tell me what individual, what person, or what family of people, or what clan of people, or what language, or what nation, or what ethnicity rules by superior physical nature? Now, we don't have a monarchy system here, but it is in our history. We come from people who have a monarchy system, people who believed what about the royal family? They ruled by what? By right of God and due to their family, which is why when a king dies, who reigns? Generally speaking. And not just the son, but the firstborn son, the firstborn heir. If their firstborn is a girl, it's actually the first son that's born that's the heir because he has the birthright and the inheritance. What the belief is, and to be more general and clear, it's the closest living relative to the king who assumes the throne. Why is that? And for instance, if he dies without any children and there's a living brother, his brother would begin to reign. But why is that? Because there is a fundamental belief that there is something special about the family. And that this family is born to reign and to rule. Now, in their defense, many of them, not all of them, but many of them view that as a responsibility, which is what we've talked about a lot in this class over the last few months, rather than view that as an entitlement. But there are those who view it as an entitlement and who abuse. But guess what? There is no family that is superior to everyone else and deserves to rule by fiat simply because they're of that family. There's no person on the earth who has the right to exercise authority over someone else simply because they were born of a particular person. Because if you trace and there's no king in England right now, so the future king of England, if you trace his genealogy back far enough, guess what? He goes through the house of Noah and he goes through the house of Adam and Eve. Just like you and just like me. There's not anything magical or special about that family. They were granted authority not because of their inherent nature, but for other reasons. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Nobody has superior physical nature over anyone else. If you're given authority over any other person or any persons, therefore you get it as a trust. And when you get something as a trust, you are expected to do what? Okay, you're expected to preserve what is entrusted to you and to even provide a return to the one who has entrusted it to you. Let's go back to the feudal system of England for a moment. The land of England belonged to the king. The entire nation belonged to the king. The lords who reigned in various precincts throughout England, and I don't know if they used the term precinct, they probably didn't. Those had that land entrusted to them by the king. They were responsible for using that land efficiently, to getting a good return off of the land, and in turn they paid a percentage of the proceeds of that land back to the king. And so they paid taxes, and they gave food, and if they made textiles or if they made metal object, whatever it was that they produced, a portion of those went back to the king as his return off of his entrustment to them. That's the same thing we do with our money when we give it to a bank and entrust our money to a bank. They use our money, but what do we expect? To receive some interest in return. To get back, not just our money, but also a little bit of the proceeds off of our money. Because it's, after all, ours. Anytime we have authority over people, who do they belong to? They belong to God. And so our entrustment means that we must make a return of that authority to God. God is expecting to receive back off of what he has entrusted unto us. Let's look at a picture of this. Turn to Matthew 25. Let's start reading around verse 14, and we will read just through verse 30. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. All right, there's the premise of what Jesus is teaching here. We have someone who owns something, and he is entrusting what he owns to others. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his ability. And then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went along, dug in the ground, and hid his master's money. Now this is an important thing here. Does he lose or squander or otherwise, does he fail to return back what the master initially gave him? Listen to what it says. After a long time, the master of the servants came and settled accounts with them. He who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter in the joy of your master. And so you have done exactly what you were supposed to do with what I've entrusted to you. I have given you a measure of authority over, in this case, the story is 5 talents of money. You have used that entrustment well. You have done a good job. I'm going to reward you with even more. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Again, this servant, by the way, it's by no accident that these people who have received this authority and entrustment over the master's possessions are referred to as servants, because they are not overseeing of their own volition. They are serving the master who owns. This man did exactly what he should do. He put it to work. He returned what was given to him, and he returned more, which the master expected, and is told, Well done. You've been good overseeing a little bit. I'm going to let you oversee much. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. All he brings back is what was initially entrusted to him. What is the master's response? You did good, you kept it safe, you didn't lose anything. Is that what he says? No. His master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he who has an abundance, but from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Now, there's all kind of applications we can make with this, but here's the general principle. When God entrusts someone to our care, whether it be a child, whether it be a family, whether it be a congregation of his people, whether it be a city or a state or a nation, it doesn't matter. When we have been entrusted to care for God's people, we are expected to use that oversight to serve his desire and to return them to him with growth and increase. We can't say, I didn't lose anything. We have to do the very best we can to provide increase. Now, this isn't talking about numbers of people. Very often it's actually talking about what? Quality, behavior, mindset. We have an obligation as parents to train and teach our children. We can't bring them back to God and say, well, here they are, but not have trained them in the ways of God. As the children of God, who has God entrusted to us? As Christians. You ever thought about the fact that Christians have people entrusted to them? Flip over a couple of chapters. Let's see. Where do we want to be? Maybe just one chapter. Where's the Great Commission in Matthew? 28:16, 28? Yeah, 28:16. Flip over to 28:16. No, that's actually not right either. It's in here somewhere. 28:19. Thank you. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God has entrusted to his people the balance of mankind. to make sure that we provide them the information so that they might become disciples. If we don't do that, you realize we're going to give an answer to God. If all we do is say, hey, here, you have what is yours, guess what God's going to say? You should have done something. Think about this in these terms. Let's imagine ourselves back in the sharecropping days of the United States. A man owns 100 acres. He personally farms 70 of it, and he parcels out 2 15-acre plots to 2 different people to sharecrop. And the agreement is you can live on this land and you can farm this land, but I get 15% of the produce. And from one, you continually get a goodly amount of return, but from the other, you continually get nothing. What does that landowner do with those 15 acres? Listen, there's a line a mile long of people who want to sharecrop that land. So what does he do? He gets rid of that guy and gives it to somebody else who will work it. Think about that. Think about that a lot, because ultimately it's the same relationship. This goes true for every aspect. When God entrusts someone to our care, in this parable it's entrusting talents to our oversight. It's the same principle. When he entrusts someone to our care, we are expected to return them to him with growth and with increase. They should know more about God when we're through. They should be stronger in their faith when we are through. They should develop and grow closer to God. They should be reconciled to God. They should be provided everything that they need in order to be successful. Wrap this up, Romans 14 and verse 4. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls. This is talking about, listen, everything and everyone is owned by God. That is our master. God is the master. I am not the master. I don't have the right to rule over others. God does. Verse 7 and 8, same chapter. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or we die, we are the Lord's. Everyone is the Lord's. And then finally, verse 12. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. We are all going to be we've had things entrusted to us. We've had people entrusted to us. We've had relationships entrusted to us. Each one of us will stand before God and answer for how we dealt with what he trusted us with. And that is an important lesson to learn. We are not in authority or ruling because of something inherent within us. We are being entrusted by God with something that belongs to him. And we have an obligation to serve in a way that they profit and benefit from the relationship. And we're going to ultimately answer to God for whether that's true or not. Any questions or comments? That's exactly right. That's an important lesson. In places where there are monarchies, authority doesn't stream from the king or his family. And in places where there are not monarchies, where there are democracies, it does not arise from the people. All authority streams from God.